Please and please subscribe to this channel and support us. Your subscription means a lot to us.
All right, coming up. Deck's clear.
On the morning of January 23, 1960, a man named Walter Hale climbed into a steel sphere smaller than a closet, shook hands with a young Navy officer named Daniel Marsh, and prepared to do something no human being had ever done before. He was not afraid of dying. He had already made peace with that possibility hours earlier, in the quiet before dawn, when the ocean outside his window was still calm enough to hide what was waiting beneath it. What Walter didn't know, what no one on that ship could have known, was that somewhere past 9,000 meters down, his vessel would crack. Not metaphorically, not somewhere in the distance. Right there, inches from his face, in the one pane of glass standing between him and a wall of water heavier than anything ever built by man. The sound came like a gunshot, a sharp, violent crack that rattled through the entire steel sphere and froze both men in place. Walter looked at Daniel, and neither of them said a word for several seconds. They were already 30,000 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, further down than any human had ever traveled, and the only thing standing between them and the crushing weight of the entire sea above them had just made a sound no engineer ever wants to hear. They had two choices in that moment: turn back and live with never knowing what waited below, or keep going and risk becoming the deepest grave in human history. They kept going. For nearly 5 hours, the two men sank through total darkness, past the last traces of sunlight, past the point where any living creature was supposed to be able to survive, into a world that had existed for billions of years without a single human witness. And when they finally touched the ocean floor, deeper than Mount Everest is tall, something moved outside their window, something alive, in a place where nothing was supposed to be able to live at all. To this day, we have photographed the surface of Mars in more detail than we have mapped our own ocean floor. We have sent men to the moon 9 times, and yet more than 80% of the seafloor covering 71% of this planet remains completely unexplored. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because Earth is not one world. It never was. This is not simply a story about one dive, one machine, or 2 brave men. This is the story of an entire hidden civilization of life that has existed on this planet since before the first fish crawled onto land, since before the dinosaurs, since before nearly every chapter of the story you learned in school. And for almost the entirety of human history, we had no idea it was there. 3 questions will guide everything that follows. First, why did it take humanity so much longer to reach the bottom of our own ocean than it took to reach the surface of the moon, 250,000 miles away? Second, what exactly lives down there? In a world without sunlight, without warmth, under pressure that would flatten a truck like a piece of paper. And third, what happens when these 2 worlds, the one above the waves and the one below, come into direct contact with each other? Because they have, more than once. And not all of those encounters ended the way you would expect. There is a reason this story tends to disturb people who hear it for the first time. It isn't the pressure, or the darkness, or the cold, though all of that is real. It's the realization that an entire second world has been sitting directly beneath every ship, every coastline, every beach vacation, for the whole of human history, largely unexamined, largely misunderstood, and in some cases actively avoided by the scientists who were supposed to be studying it. To understand how strange this all is, you first have to understand the world you already know. Since the earliest days of human civilization, we have organized our entire existence around the 71% of this planet we can walk on. We built roads, cities, and borders across the land. We charted every mountain range, named every river, and eventually photographed nearly every square mile of dry ground from orbit. By the middle of the 20th century, there was almost nowhere on land left for a man to disappear into and never be found. The ocean was different. For most of human history, people treated the sea as a surface to cross, not a place to understand. Sailors feared what lay beneath their ships, but almost no one asked what was actually down there. The ocean floor was treated the way ancient mapmakers treated unexplored continents, filled in with guesses, myths, and warnings rather than facts. For centuries, sailors told stories of creatures large enough to pull a ship under, tentacled monsters capable of dragging entire vessels beneath the waves. Naval officers dismissed these stories for generations, filing them alongside sea serpents and mermaids as harmless superstition passed between bored, frightened men on long voyages. It would take modern science an uncomfortably long time to admit that some of those old sailors were not entirely wrong. In the late 19th century, whalers and fishermen began recovering enormous, unexplained tentacles and beak fragments from the stomachs of sperm whales, evidence of a creature large enough to leave scars across a whale's body from a fight fought somewhere in total darkness. Scientists eventually confirmed the existence of the giant squid, a creature that could grow longer than a school bus, living at depths humans had never observed directly. It would take until the year 2004 for anyone to capture a photograph of a live giant squid in its natural habitat, and until 2012 for anyone to film one on camera. In other words, a creature large enough to leave claw marks on a sperm whale remained essentially a ghost story, technically real but functionally unproven, for the entire span of recorded human history until just over a decade ago. The turning point for the deep ocean itself began quietly, in a small workshop in Switzerland, where an engineer named Auguste, the father of Walter Hale, first designed a vessel capable of surviving pressures no submarine of that era could withstand. His idea was almost absurdly simple. Instead of building a rigid hull strong enough to resist the crushing weight of the deep ocean, he built a small, thick steel sphere, just large enough to hold 2 men, and attached it beneath a massive tank filled with lighter fluid, the way a hot air balloon rises through the sky. Except this vessel was built to sink through water instead of rise through air. He called it a bathyscaphe. Few people believed it would work. Fewer still believed anyone would be foolish enough to ride inside it to the deepest point on Earth. By the time Walter Hale and Daniel Marsh,
Depth holding. Systems green. Copy. Trimming for current. Watch the pressure
the
spike.
vessel had already
Compensating now.
survived dozens of test dives, each one pushing slightly further into the dark than the last. But nothing had prepared them for the descent into the Challenger Deep, the deepest known trench on the entire planet. A scar in the ocean floor formed millions of years ago, where 2 massive tectonic plates collide beneath the Pacific. The first 30 minutes were almost peaceful. Sunlight faded slowly, then all at once, the way a room goes dark when someone closes a heavy curtain. By 1,000 feet, there was no light left at all, only the small glow of instruments inside the cabin, and the endless black pressing against the window. Somewhere past 6,000 feet, the water temperature outside had dropped low enough to numb exposed skin in seconds. Both men wore layers of clothing inside a cabin that had no heating system, relying on nothing but their own body heat and thick canisters of chemical absorbent to keep the air breathable for the next several hours. Somewhere past 9,000 meters, nearly 30,000 feet beneath the surface, came that crack. Neither man spoke for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few seconds. In that silence, both of them ran through the same calculation. If the outer window had truly failed, they would not simply be in danger, they would already be dead, crushed instantly by pressure exceeding 16,000 pounds per square inch, roughly the equivalent of a stack of 50 jumbo jets pressing down on a single square inch of steel. The fact that they were still breathing, still alive, still able to hear each other's voices, told them the main sphere had held. What had actually cracked was a smaller outer viewing pane, not the pressure hull itself. It was, in hindsight, a survivable failure. In the moment, neither of them knew that for certain. They chose to continue anyway. 4 hours and 47 minutes after leaving the surface, the Trieste touched the bottom of the Challenger Deep at a depth of nearly 36,000 feet, a point so deep that if Mount Everest were placed inside that trench, its peak would still sit more than a mile underwater. A cloud of fine silt rose around the vessel as it settled, so thick that for several minutes, visibility outside the window dropped to almost nothing. When the silt finally cleared, both men reported something that, to this day, remains debated among scientists. They claimed to see a flat, pale creature resembling a fish resting on the ocean floor beside them, in a place where marine biologists of that era had assumed almost nothing could survive at all. They stayed at the bottom of the world for exactly 20 minutes, long enough to confirm their depth readings, long enough to look around, long enough to understand they had just done something no human being would repeat for more than half a century. Word of the dive reached the American public almost immediately, and for a brief moment, it captured the same kind of awe that would later surround the moon landing 9 years afterward. Newspapers ran headlines about the men who had gone deeper than anyone in history. Politicians praised it as proof of American ingenuity during the tensest years of the Cold War. But almost as quickly as the celebration began, the scientific community turned its attention to a much stranger, much more uncomfortable question: if life could survive at the bottom of the deepest trench on the planet, in complete darkness, unbeen or crushing pressure, at near freezing temperatures, then how much of what we assumed about the limits of life on Earth was simply wrong? For years afterward, the scientific consensus on that reported creature remained split. Some researchers argued it may have a type of sea cucumber, a soft-bodied animal capable of surviving extreme depths, misidentified in the silt and low visibility. Others maintained that whatever the two men saw, the mere fact that any form of life was present at that depth at all, represented one of the most significant biological discoveries of the 20th century. Either way, one truth became impossible to ignore. We had assumed the deep ocean was essentially a lifeless desert. That assumption was wrong. Around the same period, an entirely separate mystery was unfolding beneath the surface of the world's oceans, one with far greater stakes than a single research dive. Throughout the Cold War, American and Soviet submarines regularly operated in extreme secrecy at depths far shallower than the Challenger Deep, yet still deep enough to remain completely invisible to the world above. In 1963, an American submarine was lost with its entire crew during a deep test dive off the coast of New England. Crushed at a depth investigators believe exceeded its hull's design limits, its wreckage later found scattered across the seafloor in pieces small enough to fit in a briefcase. 5 years later, a second American submarine vanished without warning in the Atlantic, its final resting place not discovered for months, its cause still debated by naval historians to this day. Both incidents were sobering reminders that the deep ocean did not forgive mistakes, and that pressure at those depths could destroy in fractions of a second what took years to build. Sonar operators on both sides of the Cold War routinely picked up unexplained acoustic contacts, sounds and signals that did not match any known vessel, any known submarine, or any known marine animal on record. Many of these contacts were later explained as ice cracking, underwater currents, or misidentified whale calls. But not all of them were ever fully explained. Some remain unresolved in declassified military records to this day, filed away as unidentified acoustic phenomena, a phrase that sounds clinical and reassuring until you consider what it actually means. Someone, somewhere, heard something under the ocean that they could not identify, and to this day, still cannot. One of the strangest of these recordings would not surface publicly until decades later. In 1997, hydrophones planted across the Pacific Ocean by American researchers picked up an extremely powerful, ultra-low-frequency sound, loud enough to be detected by sensors thousands of miles apart. Researchers nicknamed it the bloop. For years, its origin was a genuine mystery, discussed seriously among oceanographers, since its acoustic profile did not match any known submarine, whale, or geological event on record. It would take over a decade of research before scientists concluded the sound likely originated from a large ice quake, ice cracking and fracturing somewhere in Antarctica. The explanation was eventually deemed satisfying by most of the scientific community. But for the years in between, one of the most powerful and widely discussed underwater sounds ever recorded by human instruments had no confirmed source at all. For nearly 2 decades after the Trieste's historic dive, the biggest remaining question in ocean science had nothing to do with pressure or darkness or cold. It had to do with a rule that every biology textbook on Earth treated as absolute. All life, without exception, depended on the sun. Plants used sunlight to create energy. Animals ate plants, or ate other animals that ate plants. Every food chain on the planet, on land or in shallow water, ultimately traced back to sunlight. It was considered one of the most fundamental laws of biology. In 1977, a team of scientists aboard a submersible near the Galapagos Islands made a discovery that shattered that assumption completely. While exploring a region of the ocean floor, where volcanic activity created natural vents releasing scalding, mineral-rich water directly into the freezing deep sea, they found something that should not have been possible according to everything science understood at the time. Clustered around these vents were entire ecosystems, dense colonies of tube worms taller than a man, strange pale crabs, and other organisms found nowhere else on Earth, thriving in complete darkness, thousands of feet below any trace of sunlight. These organisms were not surviving on scraps of energy drifting down from the sunlit world above, the way scientists had assumed all deep-sea creatures must. They were building their entire food chain from scratch, using chemical energy released by the vents themselves, through a process now known as chemosynthesis. In simple terms, an entire independent ecosystem had been quietly thriving on this planet for potentially millions of years, following none of the rules every scientist had assumed were universal. It meant sunlight was not, in fact, a requirement for life. It meant an entire second method of sustaining life had existed on Earth the whole time, hidden in total darkness, waiting to be found. This single discovery reshaped an entire branch of biology almost overnight. Researchers soon realized that similar vent ecosystems existed scattered across ocean floors worldwide, each one essentially an isolated island of life, disconnected from sunlight, disconnected from the surface world entirely, running on heat and chemistry alone. Some of these vent communities were later estimated to have existed continuously for tens of thousands of years, older than most human civilizations, thriving in total silence and darkness the entire time, completely unknown to the billions of people living their lives on the surface directly above them. The implications reached far beyond the ocean floor. If life could exist without sunlight here, using nothing but chemical energy and geothermal heat, then perhaps the same could be true elsewhere in the solar system, on moons like Europa or Enceladus, worlds covered in ice with oceans hidden beneath, oceans that may be warmed from within by their own version of these same volcanic vents. NASA scientists have since cited this exact discovery, made in our own backyard, as one of the strongest arguments for why life might exist on other worlds. In other words, the discovery at the bottom of our own ocean quietly rewrote how scientists search for life across the entire solar system. Deep-sea researchers have since documented an entire catalog of creatures that seem almost designed to prove how wrong our assumptions about life have been. Giant isopods, distant cousins of the pillbugs found in any backyard garden, grow to the size of a house cat in the deep ocean, able to survive without eating for years at a time. Anglerfish use a glowing lure powered by bioluminescent bacteria to attract prey in total darkness, a survival strategy so specialized it looks almost engineered rather than evolved. Entire ecosystems have been discovered forming around the skeletons of dead whales that sink to the ocean floor, an event scientists now call a whale fall, sustaining unique communities of scavenging creatures for decades after the whale's death. Some species found nowhere else except on these slowly decaying skeletons resting in total darkness at the bottom of the sea. Here is the detail that tends to unsettle people the most once they understand it fully. Despite everything we've covered, despite submarines, sonar networks, decades of research vessels, and increasingly advanced deep-sea robotics, human beings have still only directly observed a small fraction of the ocean floor. Estimates vary, but most researchers agree. We have mapped and explored somewhere between 5 and 25% of the deep ocean in any real detail. The rest remains functionally unknown territory, closer in some ways to unexplored planetary surface than to anywhere on land. Walter Hale, in the years following his historic dive, reportedly grew frustrated that so little follow-up exploration took place at those extreme depths in the decades after his descent. Funding shifted towards space exploration throughout the 1960s, as the world's attention turned skyward instead of downward. It is a strange irony that stands at the center of this entire story. We chose to explore the stars first, largely because reaching the moon captured public imagination in a way that reaching the ocean floor never quite did. It would take until 2012, more than half a century after that first historic dive, for a second person to solo pilot a vessel back down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. A filmmaker named James, whose own submersible was custom built specifically to finally continue the work Walter Hale had started decades earlier. That decision to look skyward instead of downward has consequences that still ripple forward today. Marine biologists estimate that a significant percentage of ocean species remain completely undiscovered and unclassified. Some studies suggesting the true number of undiscovered marine species could run into the millions. Entire mountain ranges exist beneath the sea that have never been mapped in detail, some taller than anything found on land, sitting completely unnamed and unexplored beneath the waves. Sounds are still recorded by ocean monitoring equipment that do not match any known source, some cataloged and studied for years before ever being explained, and some that remain unexplained still. The ocean, in other words, is not a fully understood system we simply haven't gotten around to double-checking. It is a genuine, active frontier, sitting directly beneath ships, coastlines, and beaches millions of people visit every single year, largely unexamined. Modern expeditions continue to find creatures and phenomena that challenge everything we thought we understood. In 2019, deep-sea researchers recorded footage of a whale, believed to be a species rarely observed alive, surfacing with fresh, unexplained scars, the kind of markings researchers associate with encounters against creatures large enough to leave lasting damage. Encounters that almost certainly took place far below any depth a camera has ever reached. Every year, new species are discovered in trenches previously assumed to be barren, uninhabitable, or too extreme to sustain any form of complex life at all. Each discovery quietly reinforces the same uncomfortable truth. Whatever rules we think govern life on this planet, the deep ocean seems determined to prove at least some of them wrong. So here is the question worth sitting with once this story ends. We spent the back half of the 20th century pointing our best instruments, our brightest minds, and our largest budgets toward outer space, searching for signs of life on distant worlds we may never actually reach. And the entire time, an equally strange, equally unexplored world sat directly beneath our own oceans, closer than any star, filled with life that broke rules we assumed were universal, and largely ignored, simply because it was harder to romanticize than a rocket launch. What do you think is still waiting down there that we haven't found yet? If you could choose to explore one truly unknown place on this planet, the deepest trenches of our own ocean, or the surface of a distant planet, which one would you choose, and why? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because if this story genuinely surprised you, wait until you hear what modern deep-sea expeditions have recorded in the trenches even deeper than this one. Sounds, creatures, and readings that scientists are still trying to explain to this very day. Two worlds exist on this planet. You have only ever really known one of them. And somewhere, right now, in complete darkness, miles beneath the surface of the ocean you may have swum in this past summer, the other one is still waiting to be found.